you today a case that tells you that the well-being of society as a whole should be based on nothing but the will of the majority. And in doing so, they ignore the minority. We think the minority, in a lot of cases, are just as important, and in all cases, are much more disenfranchised than the majority. In quoting Nelson Mandela, they told you something along the lines that just because we pass a law doesn't mean it will solve social programs. What we realize on Team Canada is that the only way to solve social problems is if we pass the law first. We have consistently given you the stats today on Team Canada that we acknowledge the vital importance of socioeconomic rights for all, but specifically the disenfranchised. We've told you that the prosperous gains that South Africa experienced after enshrinement of these rights have been great, and we told you that the only way to allow these gains to continue across the entire world is if we pass this bill. Before we get into the three themes that this debate has come down to, let's talk burdens. Because Team Singapore has acknowledged that they think that socioeconomic rights are a generally good thing. They accept that. In doing so, they either have to allow our bill to pass or provide you a better measure, no thank you, of which they can allow those socioeconomic rights to be institutionalized. We don't think they've done that. We don't think that they can do that. Let's talk exactly about why under the three themes of this debate today. The first one being the idea of, are these rights fundamental to all humans? The second one being, are we justified in passing this bill in both terms of practicality and principles? And then finally, we're going to talk about why the Constitution needs to be the method by which we approach this bill. Okay, let's get right into about talking why socioeconomic rights are in fact fundamental to all humans. We talked about the fact that socioeconomic rights are prerequisites to political rights. We talked about the fact that socioeconomic rights provide a very, very basic, no thank you, effect of well-being for those who otherwise wouldn't be able to achieve it on their own. And it provides people with individual agency. The only response to this that we heard was that it's all about democratic will. When we told you that there are individuals who are born into a situation, no thank you, because of their socioeconomic class, because of their demographic, or because of their ethnicity, and they aren't provided the same things, they aren't provided the same opportunity as anybody else in society, Team Singapore told you that the majority should be able to control that. We think that is an incredibly dangerous stance. We would ask the question of Team Singapore, if the majority voted blacks out of free speech in America, would that be okay? We understand that whether you're dealing with political rights or socioeconomic rights, there are minority groups, no thank you, who are the most vulnerable in society and who need to be protected and cannot be protected under conventional forms of democracy. That's why we're passing this bill. We have not heard adequate response to that. Okay, what Team Singapore did talk to you about was the idea of why the right of the collective should come over the right of a few. When they're talking about taxpayers, when they're talking about corporations over the disenfranchised groups that we're talking about. We would say that that principle only applies under two conditions. The first one being once you pass a certain barrier. We think that the rights of the collective sometimes can come over the rights of the individual, but only when everybody is given a very basic standard of well-being and a very basic ability to search for equal opportunity. Second of all, we would say that this only applies when people have actually been given a chance. It is dangerous and unfair to say that everything should come down, no thank you, to the collective, when there are individuals outside that collective who have never been given a chance and are not being given a chance right now. The only response that we heard to this was a sort of principle analogy when talking about why we wouldn't give everybody in the developed world and force them to give their money to the developing world. We would say that when we're talking about a constitution and we're talking about a state, no thank you, we're also talking about a social contract. And the sovereign right for all states to provide the best, no thank you, for the individuals within their society to their very best needs. We recognize a lot of states aren't doing this now, and we recognize that we have to pass this bill in order to force them to do so. So clearly we have proven this point. Now let's talk about justification, both on practice and in principle. We told you this applies to a lot of different situations. It applies to the developed world, it applies to transitional states, and it applies to the developing world. When we're talking about the first two, there are quite a few resources available, and it's pretty easy to do. When we're talking about the final one, we brought forth a lot of systems, no thank you, about how these socioeconomic rights come about. We talked to you about profit cuts for corporations. We talked to you about taxation, which Team Singapore actually supported, and we talked about revenue neutral spending. We didn't really hear much response to any of this stuff. The only thing that we heard was that they would say, when we're talking about corporations, that they have like an undue amount of power in constitutions. We would say that that's not true, and exemplified by the fact, no thank you, that corporations have been ruled against multiple times in South Africa for the rights of the individual. The only response that we heard to this was that that's because people like the minorities in South Africa, and we think that that logic falls to our side of the house. We've constitutionalized socioeconomic rights, and as a result, the minorities are getting what they need. No thank you. We think that logic definitely falls for us, and we're really happy Team Singapore brought it up. Okay, and then they talked about this whole idea, which we think is a little bit absurd when we're talking about resources, that like people aren't going to donate to charity anymore because they're going to feel like they're being oppressed by the government and the individuals who can't provide for themselves. We would say, once again, we point to South Africa, where like that isn't something we've noticed, and when we're talking about big corporations, we point to lots of stats from South Africa, and the only reason we're bringing this up so much is because it's the only state that's done so for, one more please, where 4 million people have been given access to clean running water, 900,000 housing units have been completed, all under this bill. Those are against corporations' wants, but they support the wants of the individual. We think that clearly works, yes.
Sir, please answer my second speaker's point that it isn't so simple to say there's some kind of baseline standard of living because of the fact that everybody has a different conception of a good life and the rich are a lot better able to push it through the courts than the poor, sir.
Okay, what we would say is that the fact that rich are much able to push it better than the poor through courts just isn't true based on empirical evidence that we've given you time and time and time again. And we're talking about like a different basic standard. We think that, yeah, in some situations there is a different basic standard, and we think that that's okay. That's why we give the courts the ability to justify the reasoning, to say within available resources, and we haven't heard a response to that part of our model at all from Team Singapore.
So
what we're suggesting, no thank you, on Team Canada is that there are individuals in society who are disenfranchised politically and socially, and as a result cannot realize their political rights or their socio-economic rights, and that this bill is absolutely necessary in empowering them. So clearly, we've also won on the point of justification and practicality. Now let's talk about the Constitution. We've told you that the Constitution protects these people at all times. We've told you that the Constitution holds governments accountable, not based just on their political policies.
Sir.
And no thank you, we've talked to you about the flaws of democracy in terms of those who don't have political power and those who the government neglects. The only response we heard to that was the idea that those who are politically and socially disenfranchised can like form groups and become franchised. That doesn't always work, ladies and gentlemen. That's why when we're talking about nations like Brazil, when we're talking about nations like India, or even when we're talking about nations like the United States, there are huge, deep-rooted problems in terms of social inequality. There are huge, deep-rooted problems that say that somebody who was born in a certain area or to a certain ethnicity is not able to access the same level of opportunity, no thank you, as anybody else. And the response we got to this was sort of that we're being communist. And we think that's absolutely ridiculous because, once again, we're not saying that everybody should have everything that everybody else has. What we're saying is that people shouldn't be born into a situation in which they don't have the opportunity to access equality. That's the exact thing that we're supporting on Team Canada, and we haven't actually heard any direct clash to that stance. We've only heard a bunch of peripheral and kind of ridiculous issues come from Team Singapore. Then they talked to you about why the judicial power is unelected. That's a bad thing. They didn't give you any reason why that's a bad thing. Let me tell you why it's actually a good thing. Because when the judicial power is unelected, that means that they don't have an inherent bias in only appeasing the powerful and the majority. When it's an unelected judiciary system that is supporting those who otherwise wouldn't have political power. Groups that we've talked to you about all the way from Nepal to Namibia to Brazil to India and to the United States. Groups that Team Singapore has yet to engage with, and groups that we really hope they do in their next speech. When people do not have a political power, we need to give them constitutional power. We haven't heard anything about that either. Team Canada understands these socioeconomic rights are important in and of themselves, and that they are important in enabling people to realize their other rights. We also understand that a lot of people are put in an unfortunate situation where they are not able to access opportunity and equality. We would change that. We propose.